Hey everyone, welcome back to Steve's View. Today we're diving deep into what just went down in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, over October 25th and 26th. This wasn't just any meeting. It was a high-stakes two-day trade negotiation between the US and China, and the outcomes could affect global markets, international trade flows, and even the future of supply chains for years to come. I'm going to break this down in plain English, step by step, so you really understand what's happening behind the headlines. So first off, who was there? On China's side, there was Vice Premier He Lifeng, one of the most powerful figures in China's economic policy circle, and Li Chenggang, China's chief representative for international trade. On the US side, there was Robert Lighthizer and his team, the people who really understand tariffs, trade enforcement, and negotiation tactics. These are the folks who have been shaping US-China trade policy for years, through both tough negotiations and trade wars. The big takeaway after 2 days of talks: both sides called the discussions constructive. Now, if you're hearing this and thinking, okay, so what does that actually mean? Let me explain. In diplomatic language, when US officials say constructive, they're basically signaling, we had honest, detailed discussions that advance the conversation, but don't mistake this for a finished deal. It's the polite way of saying, we didn't get into a fight and progress was made, but this is just the start. They also mentioned looking forward to continuing tomorrow, which might sound boring, but is actually classic first-day diplomacy. It's a safe way to communicate that things are moving forward without committing to anything final. Why all the caution? Context is key here. November 1st was approaching, a big deadline because Trump had threatened to impose a 100% tariff on a range of Chinese goods. Also, by the end of the month, a high-level meeting between Trump and China's leader was scheduled. If the talks had broken down before then, it could have triggered massive market disruption. So, both sides were heavily motivated to show progress, keep negotiations alive, and create what they call a constructive atmosphere. When diplomats say something like extremely constructive, it's essentially code. Here's how it translates. 1. Preliminary framework agreement. Both sides have agreed on a basic blueprint or direction for a deal. Nothing is legally binding yet. It's more about setting the stage for the leaders to make the final call. Open and honest discussion. The phrase candid and in-depth is often used. In plain English, it means both sides put their disagreements on the table without hiding anything, but that doesn't mean they resolve the differences. 3. Maintaining the status quo. Statements like "we must preserve hard-won results" are warnings. In Beijing's phrasing, it's basically, don't try to push us for more concessions right now. Respect the framework we agreed on. Or it could backfire on you. Diplomatic language is often like a code, and knowing how to read it is essential if you want to understand what's actually happening. Let's break down the actual issues discussed. 1. Tariffs. The most visible point of contention has always been tariffs. The preliminary agreement included pausing or extending exemptions for certain tariffs. China was very focused on this because despite the trade war, their exports to the US are still a major economic lifeline, even if direct trade between the two countries has declined. China has found ways to route goods through other countries, like ASEAN nations, to circumvent tariffs. So, a shipment might leave China, stop in Malaysia or Vietnam, and then end up in the US market. This workaround keeps goods flowing while technically obeying tariff rules. Think about it. The US accounts for roughly 30% of global consumption. No other market can match that size, especially in sectors like electronics, consumer goods, and agriculture. For China, closing off trade with the US entirely would be catastrophic, even if they have growing domestic markets. On the other side, the US can't fully cut off China either, because critical supply chains and raw materials still depend on Chinese production. Both sides need each other, at least for now. 2. Agricultural products. Soybeans were a key topic. Earlier this year, China had been buying soybeans from Brazil. But during these talks, they agreed to resume purchases from the US. This is a big deal because it shows China is willing to make concessions to maintain stability in the negotiation process. Here's why this matters. Soybeans aren't just for eating, they're processed into oil and feed for livestock. Food security is a serious concern for China. They can't just rely entirely on imports from another country without risking disruption in domestic agriculture. 3. Rare earths. Rare earth elements are another hot topic. China has historically controlled most of the world's supply, and they've used it as a bargaining chip. But the U.S. has been actively developing domestic supply chains and alternative sources. By around 2027, the U.S. plans to be fully self-sufficient in rare earths needed for defense and high-tech industries. What this means for China: the leverage they once had with rare earths is gradually disappearing. They can still sell cheap rare earths to the U.S., but it's no longer a strategic weapon. 4. Fentanyl and controlled substances. Fentanyl and precursor chemicals were also on the table. The U.S. wants China to control these chemicals to prevent illegal production and export. The challenge? Many of these chemicals are rerouted through third countries, making enforcement tricky. China is under pressure, but doesn't have full control. Meanwhile, the U.S. has a massive domestic market problem with opioid misuse, which adds urgency to this part of the negotiation. 5. Other issues. Other points included shipping and logistics fees, TikTok regulations in the U.S., and lowering barriers to investment. TikTok is more of a leverage tool than a core economic issue for China. It doesn't significantly impact China's economy, but is politically important for the U.S. Now let's get into the strategy behind all this. Both countries are essentially playing a waiting game. China's strategy: they want to buy time. China hopes to wait out Trump's administration or at least gain leverage to maintain domestic stability. They want to keep trade flowing while continuing to strengthen their position in the global supply chain. U.S. strategy: the U.S. wants to reduce dependence on Chinese supply chains and develop alternatives through domestic manufacturing and allied countries. They're preparing to gradually replace China as the default source for critical goods. Both sides are managing risk carefully. Neither wants a cliff-edge scenario where trade stops entirely, which could trigger economic chaos. So what does this all mean for the average person or business watching this? A few key points. 1. Constructive doesn't mean done. The talks produced a framework, but nothing is finalized. It's a temporary agreement to keep trade alive. Both sides are hedging bets. China is waiting for potential changes in U.S. leadership, while the U.S. is developing alternatives to reduce reliance on China. Promises may not be fully honored. Historically, China hasn't always fully followed through on trade commitments, especially if it threatens domestic priorities like food security or strategic industries. This meeting in Kuala Lumpur is just one chapter in a long, complex story. Think of it like a chess game. Each side is positioning pieces, waiting for the right move, and testing the other side's responses. Trade isn't just about economics, it's about strategy, leverage, and long-term planning. The takeaway? Both countries are managing a soft decoupling, carefully navigating tariffs, supply chains, and trade flows. Neither wants a total shutdown, but both are preparing for a world where they might eventually reduce dependence on each other. It's a game of patience, strategy, and timing. All right, that's the extended breakdown of the U.S.-China trade talks in Kuala Lumpur. If you found this helpful, hit that like button, subscribe, and leave a comment with your thoughts. Do you think the leaders' upcoming meeting will finalize a deal, or is this just another step in a long negotiation? Stay tuned. This story is far from over.